Howdy, glad you could join me. I'm in the wood shop today using up some more wood odds and ends that I have in the bin. I've been thinking about making this project for a while now, but I couldn't really decide on what style I wanted to build to show you because while it's probably the simplest build to do, it can be done in countless styles. So instead of one, I'm going to do 6 of them. And if that's got your curiosity up, well, stick around and see what I come up with. I've picked out several different species of wood, and I've got a few different versions in mind. So I look them over to see which sides are the best looking and what I want to do for each one. What I'm going to be making are wall sconces, and that term covers a few different things, including electric light fixtures, but that's not the type I'm going to be making. I'm making very simple ones to be candle holders. I think these are a great and easy project to build for beginners, but they're a very desirable item to have. They're a nice decoration to have on the wall, but they turn functional if you have a power outage, which could be more often with all the demands being put on the power grid nowadays. So if you build them for yourself or to give as gifts or to sell, I think they're well worth your time to build. I saw a bunch of them on Etsy, all different prices, so I'd probably try selling them locally instead of online, but that's just me. I'm going to start out with the cheap wood, pine, and do the easiest build first, then work my way up through some hardwoods to get a little more fancy as I go. This is a very simple design, basically just sticking 2 pieces of board together, but I'm going to knock the corners off at a 45-degree angle on the top corners of the upright part and also the front corners of the shelf. Once I get them marked out on the upright, I do that on the power miter saw, but you could use a manual miter box or just cut them freehand with a handsaw. Once those are cut, I use that to mark them on the shelf portion. Then cut those and cut it off to length. And this is a regular 1x4, so 3.5 inches wide, and I cut it to a length of 3.5 inches also for the shelf. Now it's just a matter of joining them together. I went by eye on where to put the shelf on there, and it ended up to be about 3 inches up from the bottom to the bottom of the shelf, and the upright is 12 inches long. I just clamp it on there to hold it in place to drill for the first screw, and once I have that screw in, I can take the clamp off and drill for the other screw. Then I take it back apart and do a little sanding and knock off all the sharp edges. Then put it back together, adding a little glue in addition to the screws, which is more than enough to secure this unsupported shelf, as this is going to be for a tea candle or tea light. One of the 1.5-inch screws did strip out when I put it together the second time though, so I had to replace that one with a longer screw, but that solved the problem. After I clean up the glue squeeze out and do a little hand sanding, I grab the drill with a Forstner bit to drill out a pocket to hold the tea light, and I think this was a 40mm bit, which is more than big enough, as I think those little tea candles are like 1.5 inches in diameter or so. This bit wasn't very sharp though, and made a bit of a sloppy job of it, but it got the job done in the end. It would have been better if I'd have done it on the drill press before I put it together, so bear that in mind if you make one like this. I cleaned that up with some 80 grit sandpaper, and then I need a way to hang it, so the simplest way is to use a keyhole bit in the router table. since these don't support much weight. So that's what the first one looks like. On to the second one. Well, the first one was regular white pine. This is beetle kill pine here, which, if you're not familiar, it has those black striations through the grain of the wood from the pine beetles boring in and introducing a fungi or fungus, I don't know what the proper term is there, to the living tree, which eventually kills it. Anyway, I'm going to do a little different treatment to this one, so I'm making a kind of a breadboard handle. I'm just using a small jar lid as a round template to mark the end shape, and then again to recurve it out to the edge, and then I just freehanded to finish it out and blend it back into the edge. I forgot to hold it up to the camera, but you can kind of see it when I take it to the drill press to drill out the center hole. And you'll get an even better look after I cut it out on the bandsaw. The jigsaw would work here too for these cuts. I had two pieces of 3.5-inch wide board for this one, but this is long enough that I can cut 3.5 inches off the end and use that for the shelf piece. Since this one is kind of a curvy piece up at the top, I'm going to round over the rest of the corners to match. So I'm using the same jar lid. I mark the shelf and the bottom of the upright and round those over just using the belt sander for hogging most of it off, and then the disc sander to fine tune them down to the marks. Then I use the oscillating spindle sander to clean up those inside curves, and that thing works really well for that. Then I decided to do a round over on the side and front edges of the shelf and the front edges of the upright on the router table, so kind of keeps with the curvy theme. And when I was putting it together, I realized I didn't really plan ahead and allow for the round over when I cut the shelf. I should have narrowed it up a bit by a ½ inch or so the back corners don't hang over the round over on the upright. And you'll see what I'm talking about when you see it up close. I started drilling these and decided I better use my countersink bit first to get the screws flush or below flush without stripping out any more screw holes, especially since I'm going into end grain. Then a little glue cleanup with a plastic straw and some final sanding. I had also dropped the center hole over the round over bit to soften the edges on that, and it did some burning, which is kind of common when the bit is engaged all the way around. So I had to work a bit to get the burn marks sanded out, first with my finger, Then I used sandpaper wrapped around a small dowel, which worked pretty well, especially with coarse sandpaper. And there's that one. And you can kind of see what I was talking about there with the edge hanging out over the roundover. That would have looked better with that shelf narrowed down by a 1/4 inch or so on each side. That's something to bear in mind if you make some like this, and something I'll think about too as I do the rest of them. I got 2 done on the first afternoon, and with the dawn of a new day, we'll start on the next one. This is a hardwood of some sort, not sure what species it is, but it's the same wood I used for the mallet build along with the hickory, if you saw that video. I'm cutting various size blocks here. The main upright is a 1x6, so 5.5 inches wide, and the upright piece is about 14.5 inches long, and the shelf is 5.5 inches square. The next smaller block is 3.5 inches square, and the small one is 1.5 by 2.5. I give all those a good going over with the random orbit sander, and then it's time for assembly. I change it up a little bit on this one. I clamp it in place first like before to hold it, but then I shoot a couple brads in to hold it in place for the glue to dry. This one will have support under the shelf, so screws are not as critical, although I do add some later. I don't know it yet, but I screwed up here and placed the shelf in the wrong position. I got it all on there, all squared up and nailed in, and then moved on to putting the support pieces together. I'm putting these together first because I want to attach them from behind so there are no fasteners of any kind showing from the front. I get those pieces centered and squared to each other, clamped, and then brad nailed together from the backside. And it's right here that I realized my mistake. I wanted a 1-inch reveal on all sides of each block, so the shelf needed to be up another inch from the bottom.
That was dumb.
So, do I take it back off and reposition, or just leave it? My original design idea won out, and I took it off to reposition it. The only problem with this is one of the brad nails will be exposed, so I'll have to deal with that, which proved to be a little troublesome because those brad nails are almost impossible to remove from hardwood. My only choice was to use a nail set to drive it below the surface, and then I used some glue and sawdust from sanding over it to hide the hole, which didn't work great, but it's small and under the shelf, which will be in shadow, so it could pass for a small knot in the wood. So this time I installed the blocks first, so I had those where I wanted them, which was spaced up an inch from the bottom, then glued and nailed those on. And then installed the shelf. With everything finally where I wanted it, I drilled and put in a couple screws for good measure. And that one is done. What would you call that? Craftsman style? Okay, the next one is going to get an OG profile on the edges. So with that bit installed in the router table, I attempt to cut that in. And this thing was not cutting well at all. It was burning and not cutting clean. Either this wood is super hard or that bit is totally used up. Time for a bit change. And that was the problem. A cheap bit to start with that didn't take much use to dull it. This new one is cutting much better. Router bits are expensive, but good ones yield much better results, so definitely worth the money. That's more like it. After the lesson learned on the second version, I measured the flat area between the profiled edges and cut the shelf piece to match that width.
He is smart.
I cut the profile on the upper edges of the shelf, but for the shelf support, I wanted to cut it on both sides. So I positioned the fence even with the edge of the bearing to make sure I could support the piece well for both cuts. And I had to lower the bit to change the profile some, but it'll look okay, I think. Quick sanding, a little dust cleanup. And since clamping and adding a brad or two worked so well on the last one, I did the same again on this one, making sure I got everything square before drilling for the screws. And just for reference, if you're curious, this one is 16 1/4 inches long. Total width is about 4 inches with 3 1/4 inches of flat between the profile edges. So that's the overall width of the shelf. And it's about 4 inches deep. And up from the bottom about 4.5 inches. And the support piece is 2.5 by 3. The next one is going to be pretty simple. I'm just going to use a triangular support piece, and I'm just going to put a chamfer on all pieces with a chamfer bit in the router table. This is some wood that has partial spalting in it, and it's also got a corner knocked off that was from a big knot, and it's pretty much at a 45-degree angle. So I'm going to leave that defect as a feature, and that's the theme on this one. I cut all the other corners off the upright and the shelf at 45s. The chamfers are 45s, and the support piece is a right angle, so it's at a 45. I used the same method of assembly, except that 45-degree support piece was pretty unclampable, so I had to get a little creative for that. After fiddling with it for a while, it was getting late in the day anyway, so I ended up rigging up a Rube Goldberg type contraption to just add some weight to it to hold it in place, and left it overnight for the glue to dry. Hey, it's not sophisticated, but it works. The next morning, with the glue holding it securely, I drilled and added a couple of screws to make it nice and solid. To my eye, that's some pretty wood. Let me know what you think. I was going to call it quits there with 5 versions done, but I had this other idea to use a couple pieces that would normally get thrown out. I had a rough cut piece of red cedar that was a sawmill offcut, and I had a round piece I hadn't thrown out yet that was a leftover from the flower pot build, one of the pieces that was cut out from one of the rings. So this main board needs a few passes through the planer, or thicknesser as they call it in the UK. I couldn't find that word though in my dictionary, but anyway, whatever you call it, it sure does improve the look of that board. This is going to be a rustic style piece, so I'm leaving the live edges that are there and using a wire wheel chucked into a cordless drill to clean them up. This works pretty well if you've got a drill that has a high speed. Otherwise, I'd use a wire wheel and the angle grinder. I started out just by holding the board on the edge of the bench and one-handing the drill, but it was much easier to use the workmate to hold the piece, and then I could wield that drill with two hands, which is less fatiguing and probably safer. Once I got the existing live edges cleaned up, I used the angle grinder with the spinning wheel of destruction to blend in the cut edges of the board to look like live edges all the way around. This thing definitely can chew through some wood and is the perfect tool for making faux live edges. It's really good at making sawdust too, so you definitely need a dust mask or respirator when you're using it. It does leave the edges pretty rough though, so it requires quite a bit of sanding, which made this build the one that took the most time and effort to make. I did a little cleanup with the belt sander, but it's kind of hard to see what you're doing with this type of belt sander, so I ended up moving to the random orbit sander pretty quickly. This isn't a hardwood, so even with a medium to higher grit sandpaper, it goes pretty well and it takes all the rough spots out pretty efficiently. Did take a little time though. Then there were a couple spots where there were some bark inclusions, so I thought I could just knock it out with my pocket knife. So I tried that first, but ended up getting a hooked pick to get in there better and get all that stuff out of there. Some of it was pretty loose and came out easily, but I had to do a little digging around in there to dislodge all of it. The smaller of these two knots here was loose, so I ended up stabilizing that later on by just squeezing a little glue in there from the backside. For now though, I'm just being careful not to knock it out and lose it. So with the upright part in pretty good shape, I needed to shape a support piece, so I'm eyeing it up to see the proportions. This is a longer piece, so I'm going to hold the shelf up a little bit higher than the others and make the support piece a little longer. I'm also going to make it a little bit more of an organic shape by cutting a sort of double swoop into it, and you'll see what I mean after I cut it out on the bandsaw. Like that. I used the belt and disc sander to round over the edges of the shelf and support. I didn't use a router bit to do the roundovers because I didn't want them to look machine made. The edges on the upright are random and imperfect, so I wanted these to look a little random too, and holding them and moving them around by hand against the belt kind of gives them that look. I also cleaned them up with a finer grit with some hand sanding. You probably noticed that the round I have here has a hole drilled in it, and I'm going to take care of that right now. That was a starter hole for the jigsaw when I cut it out for the other project, but I need a flat on it anyway to go up against the upright, so I'm just cutting it off on the miter saw. That'll work. I mentioned earlier that this one knot was a little loose, so a little glue, and I'll rub it in a little bit, and that should do the trick. That's not going anywhere. After it dried a bit, it's time to assemble. This is going to be a little tricky getting this square since the edges are randomly curvy. I'll just have to do my best by eye with a little help from my square to kind of line up the shelf at 90 degrees from rough center. I fiddle and fuss and decide there's no good way to clamp it, even when I do get it where I think it's good, because, it's round. So I guess it's time for glue and another solution, which involves waiting and waiting, which is slow. So this is my method for a half-fast woodworker. Yeah, say that real fast. Anyway, when I got back from having lunch, the glue was dry, and that one worked so well, I figured I'd do it again for the support piece, which is also curvy. So after adding some glue, this is how I weighted this and weighted again. After another short break, the glue was dry enough and I could drill and add a couple screws. And they're all done and ready for finish. But that's tomorrow. Might as well keep up the variety when it comes to finish on these. So to start out, I'm going to give this plain white pine one a little character with the torch. And I know some people hate this method, but this is the only one I'm going to do it to, and I'm just sort of giving it a few highlights. Not really burning it much, more like scorching it around the edges a little bit. I'm going to do an oil-based satin polyurethane on the first two pine ones. I figured that will darken the wood a little bit, which is what I'm after. And this stuff will settle out, and it's been sitting a while, so I had to stir it. And stir it.
This is gonna take forever.
Eventually I got it mixed. I'm just applying with a brush, and I'll do at least 2 coats with a light sanding in between. If you've ever used poly, you'll know that it bubbles easily when you're applying it with a brush. Those will usually settle out, but I've found that after you apply it, drag the brush across the surface slowly and very lightly, and it will take most of them out. Next up, I'm going to do tung oil, and this is super easy to apply. You just brush on a liberal coat and let the wood just soak it up. Depending on the wood, you may have to apply a little more if it drinks it all in, but you can't really mess this up. Let the wood absorb what it wants. After 12 hours or overnight, you can rag off the excess and then let it air dry, which will take a while because it dries very slowly. But you can handle it if you need to in the meantime. I use the tung oil on the 3rd and 4th versions. For number 5, I'm just going to use some of my wax oil I made, which is just a mixture of mineral oil heated up with beeswax melted in. This just gets rubbed on with a rag or a heavy-duty paper towel like I'm using here, and then you just rag off any excess. I made up a batch of this to have on hand all the time, as the mineral oil is food grade, so it's good for cutting boards or wooden kitchen utensils and spoons or spatulas, stuff like that. And finally, for the cedar one, I'm using the water-based polyurethane, as that seems to not be as splotchy on the lighter areas of the cedar wood. I've noticed that the oil-based finishes tend to discolor those areas a little more. The water-based seems to bring out the contrast, which highlights the grain pretty nicely without the uneven penetration. I'll give you a few shots here of all the wall sconces with finish applied and doing what they're designed to do. I made these over the course of a few days, but that's working 3 to 5 hours or so in the shop each day. So you can easily build a couple of these in an afternoon or several in a full day. The cheap pine one is the smallest of them all and has the pocket for the tea light. I didn't have any of those, so I used one of the battery-powered ones here, which sticks up farther than a real tea light candle would. I feel like it looks better with a small votive-style candle, though. As does the second pine one. The finish really brings out the feature of the striations in the beetle kill pine. The small votive candle or even a small jar candle would work with these smaller sconces. This spalted hardwood one is a little taller, but still looks good with the shorter candles. It could take a taller pillar style or taper type candle though too. The tung oil finish really brought out the character of the wood on this one. I think it's one of my favorites of the batch. Now the first one with the wider boards. These can take the larger jar style candles and they still look proportional. And this one has my homemade wax oil on it. And here's the one with the partially spalted wood and the natural missing knot corner. I think this one is my favorite. It's got some dramatic grain features and it's big enough for the large jar candles. Or the shorter candles work well too. I really like the wood in this one with the grain and the spalting kind of mixed in. It's really a good looking one, I think. And finally we have the cedar one. Definitely a good looking piece. It ended up the tallest one simply because I wanted to keep as much of that board as possible. While it can hold any of the candles, with its tall and slender look, it could definitely look good with a tall taper or pillar style candle. And here's a couple examples. Took me a little longer to get this video out, and that's because it took me a few days to make these, but we also spent a few days doing a project in the mechanical side of the shop. We finally got ourselves a vehicle lift, so my son and I installed that and made a video that's on the other channel, Wingnut's Garage, if you're interested and want to give that a look. I'll put a link to it below. Oh, and if you watch the sewing ruler holder video, I promised a picture of that thing in use. So here that is. Well, that's about it. As usual, I really appreciate you watching, especially if you made it all the way through to the end. That helps the channel more than you know. Hope you decide to come back for the next one, and if you do, I'll see you then.